Good afternoon. My name is Doris Chang. I'm on the faculty in the Department of Psychology and the faculty mentor for this panel titled Injustice and Irresponsibility, Ethical Assessments of Governments, Police, and Corporations. And this panel today features presentations by Shana Sanichar and Brenna Smith. So I just wanted to start off by saying that it's been a real pleasure to work with these two young scholars whose scholarship highlights two signature features of our Lang curriculum. First, we pride ourselves in exposing students to diverse disciplinary perspectives and analytic frameworks. So this open curriculum you probably heard about here at Lang means that students are encouraged to take courses outside of their disciplines and try on different ways of tackling an issue. So today's presentation is a wonderful demonstration of that process. So I'm a clinical psychologist in the Department of Psychology. Shana is a sophomore in politics who received a prestigious social science fellowship to work closely with a graduate student from that department. And Brenna is a senior double majoring in global studies and in education studies. So in putting today's presentation panel today, we came together to discuss various ways in which we might bring their projects in conversation with each other in terms of theme and also in terms of methodology. So a second major topic that I think both of the presentations really touches on is this issue that at Lang, we really pride ourselves in providing students with opportunities to apply theory and their critical thinking skills to diverse, complex, real-world problems. We believe that learning takes place best when it happens outside of the classroom. So it's one thing to analyze problems from the relative safety and comfort from the classroom, but it's quite another to be actually in the field, working alongside policymakers, researchers, activists, educators, and artists struggling to find points of intervention to affect real social change. So both Shana and Brenna have taken their learning outside of the classroom, and they're going to talk to you today about how their experiences working with Amnesty International and in doing fieldwork in Cambodia, respectively, have shaped their perspectives on two key social problems. First, the use of deadly force and police accountability, and secondly, human and environmental rights violations by multinational clothing corporations. So Shana will speak first, followed by Brenna, and then we'll have some time at the end for conversations.
Thank you. So hello, my name is Shana Sanichar, and like Doris said, I am a second-year politics student at Lang. And my research project is titled Reviewing and Reforming Police Accountability Mechanisms, Recommendations for Civil Societies to Reform Deadly and Lethal Force Laws in United States Law Enforcement. So I'll give you a little introduction about myself before I go into my presentation. So this project was formulated out of the Social Science Research Fellowship. And at this fellowship, we had an internship over the summer, and then in the fall, we had to take the internship and formulate a research project in relation to that internship. So my internship was at Amnesty International, which is a human rights grassroots organization, and we focus on international human rights violations worldwide. And over my time there in the summer, we specifically focused on our police accountability campaign focused on lethal force. And there, my co-intern and I went to various locations throughout New York City. We went to schools, churches, community centers, and we discussed the findings of the report that Amnesty had released at that time. And so we went to places like NYU and Columbia, and people were very receptive on our information and they wanted to get involved. However, there was one moment when we went to a community center in the Bronx, and we were talking to youth of color from ages 12 to 16 years old. And this is a community that's directly impacted by the lethal force used by police. And so at that moment, I realized that I wanted to focus my research project on institutional mechanisms on how to create police accountability, and kind of take my activism and my academics and merge them into two to create a research project and recommendations. So Before I go into the findings in my report, Brenna and I, when we were reviewing both of our projects, we came up with 4 questions that we found that are in both of our projects. So our first question is, what is the problem? Our second is, why is this an issue and who is involved? Our third is, what are the ethical violations and injustices? And the fourth is, what are possible mechanisms of change? And throughout both of our presentations, we're going to be focusing on these 4 questions in relation to our research. Okay, so before I get into the findings, I just want to introduce my methodology during my research. So the 2 main documents that I focused on was the Amnesty International report, Police Accountability Report on Lethal Force, and the United Nations Universal Periodic Report that had a section on the United States and how they need to stop racialized policing. And so United States law enforcement is the main, factor that I will be looking at, because United States law enforcement is created to protect the community. However, in recent times, and throughout all time, it has showed that it's been racialized, targeting specifically Black communities and low-income communities. And this is a poster made by Amnesty International, and it says, no one should have to live in fear of those who are sworn to protect them. So I thought that really showed the, topic and the initiatives that I was trying to also hold in my research. Yes. So one of the findings in the Amnesty International report was that 50 states failed to comply with international standards on deadly force by police. So I really focused in my research on the discrepancies between international, federal, and state standards. And so international standards state that self-defense, that lethal force can only be used in self-defense, defense of others against imminent threat of death or injury, and used as a last resort. However, national standards say that officer could have probable cause, that the suspect poses a threat, but it doesn't necessarily have to be used as a last resort. So this is a huge discrepancy that has allowed for there to be lethal force used when an officer uses its own judgment, which has caused a lot of negative impacts. And there's also a Supreme Court case where it stated that the American police officers can use lethal force to prevent an escape. However, state standards have, and it only can be used as a last resort. However, state standards have not been following that and just use it when they believe that it is effective. So I have a pie chart here that shows the racial disparities between who gets targeted by police and the deaths held by police when using lethal force. So I really want to focus on the Black versus white communities. So it says for white, it's 49% police deaths, and Black is 27.6 police deaths. So you're looking at this and you're saying, okay, whites are more targeted by police. However, when we look at the population of the races in America, where Black represents only 32% and whites only represent 77.4%, we see that Blacks are about 3.5 more likely to be targeted by police. So who is impacted? Based on those statistics, we see that African Americans are disproportionately impacted by police killings. Yes, so why is this an issue? So of course it's an issue because we shouldn't be targeting our own citizens based on race. And then it's also an issue because the United States is seen as such a huge, powerful nation. And the fact that we are holding these human rights violations is not really acceptable. And it shows in the international sphere that really a powerful nation such as ours is also holding these human rights violations. And we're seen as the land of the free and the equal. But in reality, the police law enforcement is not really holding their standards up to these American principles. So I also want to note how international law plays a role in this when looking at ways to create improvement. So there's a lot, in an economic sense, you can have this give and take relationship where an international organization can come in and they can say, hey, stop this, but the United States, like I said before, being this powerful country, might not listen to international organizations. However, there needs to be a give and take relationship where the United States would be benefiting from it. So one aspect that can benefit is, I guess, the civil unrest that had erupted, and to decrease that civil unrest, and I guess the international eye looking on the United States would be to create such improvements. And if there is a successful campaign from these international organizations, this campaign will be more in demand and then could decrease police accountability, not only in the United States, but also in other countries like Brazil, where there's also racialized policing. And so another way that a mechanism in which I recommended to create improvement is through having these international organizations also create a oversight mechanism, because like the statistics I showed you before, those are also somewhat estimated guesses because there is such a lack of reporting in police departments. And because of this lack of reporting, it's really hard to create mechanisms to ensure that police are not using lethal force in a negative manner or in an inappropriate manner. And so by having these international organizations having oversight, there can be more, and making sure that they're reporting, there could be more transparency and also more mechanisms in place to increase appropriate use of lethal force and decrease the racialized targeting. And so to ensure that the police departments are not paying off these international organizations, there will be a pay control mechanism set in place. And this pay control mechanism will be a fine, and if there is a fine, this fine will be sent into the public, where it will be used in low-income communities that usually have minority groups that are negatively impacted by policing. And then this fine will can go through mental health initiatives, where usually these experiences with police are traumatic. And so, yes, I state that the U.S. must reform its laws on the use of deadly force by police. So that is my presentation and the recommendations that I have founded through my research. And so now I would like to introduce Brenna, and she will talk about her project.
Thank you. Thank you guys for coming. My name is Brenna, and I am a senior. I'm about to graduate just a few weeks in global and education studies. And as a senior, we are required to create a thesis, and typically this looks like a really big 50-page paper. But at Lang, something that Doris mentioned earlier is that we've been taught to think critically about the social injustice and the systemic inequalities in our institutions. And so I wanted to create a thesis project that extended beyond the walls of my time here at Lang and outside of the academic community, to reach a wider audience and to discuss issues that I care about, that I think relate to every single one of us. It's been important for me to figure out how to activate my own social responsibility in a world full of disorder and injustice. So I'll go back to the slide real quick. The result of that with my thesis is the creation of a podcast and a website. It's called Accomplices. And for my first episode, I am focusing on the Cambodian garment industry. So creating this podcast is going to be a way for me to acknowledge my privilege and the complications that I carry with me as an American consumer. And so I'm going to speak to you guys a little bit about the content. I'll introduce the content of my first episode and then play you a trailer at the very end. So I'm pretty lucky. I have $128 here in my pocket, which is like a lot of money, but also not a lot of money. But it's definitely very useful for me as a broke student in New York. It pays for 1 month of unlimited subway rides. You can also buy me 5 of my favorite pastrami sandwiches from Katzadeli. They are like $20 each. Maybe I could get a really cheap ticket to see Wicked. I don't know if 120 is enough. I can also buy this silk dress from H&M. But the whole point of all this is that, $128 is an amount of money that's easy for me to take for granted, especially living in New York City. But when I think on a global scale, in the way that $128 extends in different parts of the world, $128 is actually 1 month of wages in Cambodia for a Cambodian garment worker, hopefully. That doesn't include the fact that most of the garment factories don't even pay the nationwide minimum wage. But if you calculate it out, that ends up being less than $5 a day, which is ridiculous. So what is the problem? There is a very big disconnect between consumers and consciousness. And as consumers, we are intricately linked to human suffering and environmental degradation around the world through the products that we buy. Identifying the ethical violations and human rights injustices. In the global garment industry, specifically in Cambodia, there are daily reports of mass faintings, unsafe working conditions, factories collapse, and there's fires, people are trapped inside. There's forced labor. Workers often do not have breaks to go to the bathroom or to eat. They are working 6 to 7 days a week, 12 to 14-hour days oftentimes. There's also child labor still. I know it seems popular to think that child labor is not an issue anymore, but it is. And there's also a common use of short-term contracts, so that way factories do not have to provide their workers with health care, but days off, sick days off, and benefits like that. So why is this an issue and who does it impact? Well, it obviously impacts Cambodian garment workers for the reasons that I just said, but it also affects us. It's hard to realize how we are personally connected to all these reports of human suffering, but there is a direct path that leads from Cambodia to New York City and back. Brands and companies often bury all of these stories beneath corporate social responsibility and public relations campaigns and advertising. But through all of this, brands try to shield us from comprehending the atrocities that exist in countries that manufacture their products, which end up being the products that we consume, and then we become accomplices in the crimes against humans and the environment. Hence the name of my podcast. Okay, so fast fashion is a huge part of why all this suffering exists. So, especially here in America and throughout the global north, including Europe and Canada as well, we have become accustomed to a kind of cheap, accessible clothing and materials and accessories. So in order to keep up with demand, fast fashion designs change weekly and monthly, delivering to the consumers new collections all the time for the cheapest price possible. And this provides endless shopping options, and clothes can be, gives consumers the ability to buy without thinking, to buy something and throw it away a week later, and not be too concerned with the effect it's having on their wallet. This is creating huge flows of waste in the environment, and it's also putting pressure on the factories to produce at such extreme demands, which is requiring them to work long hours and not have breaks. So the fast fashion industry, many of the stores that you see listed here, along with many others, create their clothes now to quickly fall apart or to quickly fall out of style purposefully. So in the first episode of my podcast, I look at H&M specifically as a case study because they are one of the biggest brands right now in the garment industry, and they also have a really critical eye on them. There's been a lot of reports of human and environmental suffering accredited to them in their factories, but they've also been one of the biggest companies to step forward with a sustainable action plan and a ton of advertising and campaigns talking about how they are very conscious and they're very sustainable, and they're a great company. They're making great strides. So the H&M Conscious Collection is this example where H&M is trying to recycle their clothes, use organic cotton, and they're making attempts to improve all the wrongs that they've done through creating collections for people to buy that will help this. And although it has, the Conscious Collection has made some good strides regarding their environmental impact, it has done nothing to really impact the garment workers that continue to create their products and suffer immensely. So this is a picture from the Clean Clothes Campaign, which it's a great organization on the ground working with labor unions and the garment industry outside of Cambodia as well, but throughout Asia and Central and South America. And as you can see, it's more of a dramatic, but it's trying to show juxtaposition against each other of what's really going on. So I propose different things that you can do. I know it's hard. I mean, I'm constantly battling with how to live in New York and keep up with fashion and have nice, clean clothes to wear, but also be a conscious consumer. That's another reason why I'm creating this podcast, is to be able to have an active conversation with people about what we can do to change this industry. So you can educate yourself about brands and their practices. That's the first step. You can also demand that brands include factory information on their tags. So underneath where it says made in Cambodia, you can demand that they also include the name of the factory or some sort of identification code for factories, because that immediately puts them in the spotlight and the public information's out there so consumers can stay up to date on where their clothes are really coming from. You can also host clothing swaps with friends and coworkers, people in your community. It's a great way to get together with friends, and especially with, I know that I buy clothes often, I wear once, or I have the idea that I'm gonna wear it and I never do. So I often get together with my friends and we swap clothes out, which is a great way to keep my closet changing. You can also pressure your governments, local governments, as well as governments that, are involved in the fashion industry, for example, like Sweden, that's where H&M is from. So you can write to them, pressuring them to uphold the standards of imports to what we have here in the US as well. And you can also just support organizations that specialize already in improving labor rights and that are already on the ground working for this cause, because there's a lot of them now. I mean, the great thing being in 2016, there's endless resources with how to educate ourselves and create change just by getting online or looking on our phones. So one example is this organization called the Fashion Revolution, and it's actually this week, starting today through the 24th, is Fashion Revolution Week. And if you go on the website, they have a variety of ways to get involved and make change. And this week is really highlighting this movement to try to get involved in sustainable fashion. And one of the things that they're encouraging people to do is turn your clothes inside out and show the brands that you're wearing and take a picture of it, put it on social media, tag the companies that you got your clothes from, and ask them, who made my clothes? So this is the landing page for my website, which is not live yet, but it will be this week, Accomplice podcast. And so the first episode is focusing on the Cambodian garment industry. And the summary says, it's difficult to be a conscious consumer and be informed about the origins of every single product that we buy. But when human lives and the environment suffer as a direct result of our consumerism, we become accomplices to global exploitation and abuses. So join Accomplice with guests David Welsh and Dominique Flaxberg as we explore the challenges facing Cambodian garment industry, trace the adverse effects of our consumption practices, and work through the challenges of becoming an ethical consumer. And I'm going to play you guys a clip real quick.
It's not indentured slavery or servitude, but in a way it is. Throughout the supply chain, an incredible amount of money is being made by these brands. a significant amount of money is being made by the factories. The workers are nowhere near a living wage, and that's where the margins are.
It's also a cultural shift because I feel like we have awareness. No one goes to H&M not knowing the impact that it makes, but people decide to close their eyes because it's so out of their reality. It's so hard to imagine that these things happen.
For the sake of high profits, low costs, and personal financial gains, brands continue to turn a blind eye to the human suffering that is woven into our clothes. So every time you buy a new dress or a new pair of jeans, and the tag says, made in Bangladesh or made in Cambodia, do you ever stop and think about why your clothes are coming from these specific countries and why these clothes are so inexpensive? The cost of your clothes is so cheap because so many brands and corporations that we buy from, and the garment industry as a whole, operate in countries with deeply corrupt governments and institutions that operate lawlessly, and they have minimal accountability. And poverty continues to be so dominant that the people that live there are easily exploited for the sake of capitalism and globalization. As we actively consume products from countries that are constantly exploited to fulfill our wants, we become accomplices in international crimes of abuse and exploitation. So this is about erasing apathy, reconciling our privilege, and engaging with each other to answer the question, what is the real price of the clothes we are wearing? So join me, Brenna Kelsey, on the first episode of Accomplice, where we'll look at the Cambodian garment industry. I'll be joined by guest David Welsh from the AFL-CIO Solidarity Center, as well as fashion designer and student Dominique Flaxberg. And together, we're going to explore the challenges facing the Cambodian garment industry, trace the adverse effects of our consumption practices, and try to work through the complications of becoming an ethical consumer. Thanks for listening. And I will leave you guys with this. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. Thank you.
Okay, so we have about 15 minutes to take some questions from you all. And we'd love to also give the two speakers an opportunity to react to each other's presentations. And so we're just kind of opening it up right now for a discussion. Yeah.
That was great. Thank you very much. It's just more of a comment right now than a question. Probably the one thing I thought was a tagline is become an accomplice. Right? As opposed to join accomplice, but right, you become an accomplice.
I like that.
Makes you an accomplice to be accomplice. The other part of accomplice is that thinking about the meaning of accomplice, I think that there's an implication that it's the knowledge of being part of the crime that makes you an accomplice, although I guess there's a little gray area there. So in a way, you are actually creating accomplices through your podcast, since presumably somebody who might not have been aware would now be aware and therefore recognize that they're listening.
No, I love that. That's great. I think that's what a lot of this has been about is through Lang, I was able to go to Cambodia for a study abroad, and I've spent the majority of my time here studying Cambodia in a variety of capacities. And especially being on the ground there, along with my studies, so the practice and theory put together, I've obviously been privileged enough to become incredibly aware of a lot of different things. And this whole podcast is my way of trying to talk with friends and families, my family members that are disconnected from where I am, and have conversations about the things that I'm aware of and that they may not be. And so far, all the conversations I continue to have with my friends and family and other people have been receptive. They're like, wow, I never even knew these things. So I'm like, okay, great. Well, how can I get this information out faster? And how can we have a bigger conversation? So I like the idea that I'm creating accomplices. Thank you.
Something in your fast fashion presentation reminds me of kind of this catch-22 of activism. Like something that happened like around last year was a New York Times article about nail salons and how like support them because that's, you know, you're supporting slavery essentially, and then all these other nail salons were like put up posters saying like, no, please come in, like we need your money because, you know, whatever, you know, there was that whole like, we don't want to support these unfair rates, but at the same time, cutting off the income before fixing the long-term solution is kind of like an idealistic, you know, distant solution for someone not in the situation where we don't have to worry about our next meal, but where they used to like the whole thing where, yeah, you look at the label and you see it's in Cambodia, but like, is the solution to like, you know, what's the long-term solution in relation to the short term?
That's a great question. Actually, I do address that in my podcast. If you listen to the full thing. So that's one criticism of, you know, of activism and protesting. So with the garment industry, I mean, I'm sure you've heard, and possibly living in New York, you've seen protests outside of H&M, Forever 21, a lot of people boycotting, and that's actually a problem because, you know, again, you're completely right. The garment workers want jobs. You know, they want to be able to work, but they want to work in a place that's humane and where they can have breaks and where they don't pass out from fumes and heat, and where they're actually getting paid enough to where they can have, you know, a quality of life. And so it's not about boycotting and protesting. You know, we can still shop and we can still, you know, enjoy these brands and the clothes, but it's about shopping slower and smarter and trying to change the global trend right now that is fast fashion, because, you know, not only, I mean, it's killing creativity as well, which, you know, it's a huge criticism in fashion, even high fashion right now. A lot of designers are starting to walk away from collections that they're doing because people want stuff. You know, fashion collections used to happen 4 to 6 times a year. So the fast fashion industry is truly affecting all levels of fashion. But, you know, this podcast and this website and what I'm trying to do is, and also just in my own efforts, it's about creating conscious consumers, so that by putting the name of the factory underneath the Made in Cambodia, that's immediately having H&M. They have to be aware. They have to be on the ground there, constantly watching their factories. Like, I know for a fact, after, you know, spending time in Cambodia, and the guy that I interview as well, he's on the ground in Cambodia and Indonesia. You know, these brands are not present in the countries where their factories are producing their clothes, and so there's a big gap of, you know, there's no accountability and there's no pressure to create immediate accountability. So H&M starting their sustainability pledge in 2013, making a promise that in 2018 we'll pay our workers living wages. Like, that's 5 years, that's ridiculous. They are a multi-billion-dollar company, and they have the resources to make this right, and they have the resources to make it right now. So, yeah, it's about being aware and putting pressure.
Hi. Do you talk about companies that are good models that are, what, I'm just curious, like the flip side, like who's a good model out there? Because I watch this and think, oh, you know, again, thinking about the awareness of becoming an accomplice, like once you know something, great. Now, what do I do? And then the issue of, oh, but if I don't shop there, is that really the right thing to do? Or what? I'm just curious, like where else, like who else is a good model?
Yeah, so welcome to my life. Every single day, that's what I have to, I mean, I think about that all the time. I used to love shopping, and I used to love H&M. I used to love all sorts of things, and now, you know, I ripped a pair of my jeans like 2 weeks ago from like, you know, just getting a little, I've had these jeans forever. I'm like, well, crap, what do I do now? Like, what jeans do I buy? Levi's is, you know, not a good company as well with regard to their sustainability and, you know, human rights. They're one of the biggest companies that's in Cambodia, Bangladesh. But so yes, that is actually the foundation. That's my passion behind this whole project. Is, you know, I'm not an expert in this. I do not know all the answers. I have not studied fashion. I have not studied sustainability at length. I'm not trained in this at all, but I want to create a space where we create awareness, and then along with other people, we can be like, okay, we can ask these questions together, because I don't think I can come up with the answers on my own, but I know that talking with other people creates a great opportunity. And so the podcast, I was debating on whether or not to include some good companies, because I wanted to keep it relatively short and focus on one case study, but it was an important point to me to include this. So on the website is where I have a section of resources that basically include apps, websites, books, videos, resources that I'm continuing to find and collect that are super informative and are helping create conscious consumers. And I'm trying to put in, instead of just bringing the negative, like dropping a bomb on you that's just going to make you feel guilty and ruin your day, I want to be able to also provide resources that will help you do something to change as well. So that's the podcast and website working together.
I have a question for both of you. So Shana, you were a sophomore.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering what you feel like you learned from this project, and where you see yourself taking this work, or applying some of the strategies or methods or approaches you learned through this project as you move into your junior senior year.
Excuse me. So yeah, this was my first and only really large research project that I've done, and it was really, I guess, a really great experience, because I was able to take something I was passionate about in addition to something I was an activist in, and then connecting it to my academics. And I think in a place like Lang, it's very, very open to exploring your interests and being able to do something like that, instead of really having to hold a strict curriculum where I can only be learning about, like, as a politics student, maybe only be learning about theories and government structure, but instead I can also be making my own recommendations and research on how I think governments can be pressured, and exploring that. And I think it's also really beneficial for me, because I do hope to continue on to higher education, and it will also, and having a research project on just like something that I have done really will benefit me in the sense that I know how academic research is conducted. So I guess the logistics of that was really beneficial. And then also knowing how to interact with other organizations with my recommendations, because I have went and reached out to other organizations and tried to apply myself to them and tell them what I think about it. But yeah, so I would say that.
And what about you, Brenna? You're graduating. Where do you see this taking you?
Well, right now this has evolved to be something more than my thesis. Thankfully, again, like you said, here at Lang, we have flexibility and support that extends beyond the traditional structure beyond the structure of traditional pedagogy. So I'm really thankful that, right before Christmas break, when I went to my advisors and thesis professor, I was like, hey, I think I want to do a podcast instead, because this is something I want to do after I graduate. They were like, great. They were really supportive. So this is going to be a side project of mine that I continue to produce in my own time, but I may also try to pitch. This is kind of an opportunity for me to turn this into something more. So we'll see how this pans out. But I would say that, in general, doing this project has really created, or it's at least instilled confidence in my ability to, apply theory and practice and creativity and application and all of these things that I think traditionally are kept separate. And again, we've been pretty lucky to be in a school that allows us to throw it all together and do something with it. So I don't really know what's going to come after the next month when I graduate, but hopefully things should do this, something that will help support that.
Thank you so much
Thank you guys for
for
coming.
your attention.
Thank you.